The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of the grand ballroom at the Riverside Country Club, sending crystal fragments across the polished surface like fallen stars. Sarah Mitchell stood frozen in her ivory silk gown, watching the golden liquid seep into the pristine white runner that led to the altar where she should have been exchanging vows just minutes earlier. Instead, she was staring at her father's red face, his words still echoing through the suddenly silent reception hall. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Worthless. That's what you've always been, and that's what you'll always be. The 300 guests sat in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of horror and curiosity. Her new husband Jake stood beside her, his hand reaching protectively toward her shoulder, while her mother covered her mouth in shock from the front row. But it was the elderly man in the corner booth, wearing a crisp navy uniform adorned with more ribbons and medals than anyone had ever seen, who would change everything in the next 60 seconds. The story begins 3 hours earlier, when Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell was putting the finishing touches on her bridal suite, overlooking Lake Harmony. At 28, she had built a successful career as a pediatric nurse at Children's Medical Center in downtown Hartford, Connecticut. Her hands, steady enough to insert IVs into the tiniest veins, trembled slightly as she applied her lipstick for the third time. "You look absolutely radiant," whispered her maid of honor Jessica as she adjusted Sarah's cathedral-length veil. "I can't believe this day is finally here." Sarah smiled at her reflection, but something hollow flickered behind her eyes. 28 years of trying to earn her father's approval had taught her to hide disappointment well. Robert Mitchell, a successful real estate developer who owned half the commercial properties in Hartford County, had made it clear throughout her childhood that nothing she accomplished would ever be quite enough. When she graduated valedictorian from high school, he reminded her that her cousin had been accepted to Harvard. When she earned her nursing degree summa cum laude, he questioned why she hadn't become a doctor instead. When she bought her first apartment at 25, he criticized the neighborhood. The pattern had become so predictable that Sarah had learned to celebrate her victories in silence, sharing them only with her mother and closest friends. Today was supposed to be different. Today she was marrying Jake Thompson, a kind-hearted firefighter who saw her worth without conditions. Jake, who brought her coffee every morning before his shift, who listened to her stories about difficult days at the hospital, who proposed with a simple solitaire ring because he knew she valued meaning over materialism. Her father had grudgingly approved of Jake, mainly because his father owned a successful construction company, but Sarah knew that approval was conditional and could be withdrawn without warning. The wedding preparations had been a minefield. Robert insisted on paying for everything, but each decision came with strings attached. He wanted the reception at the country club, where his business associates would see the family's success. He demanded an open bar with top-shelf liquor to impress his clients. He invited people Sarah had never met, turning what should have been an intimate celebration into a networking opportunity. Sarah's mother, Linda, had tried to mediate, but 32 years of marriage to Robert had taught her to choose her battles carefully. She would whisper encouraging words to Sarah in private, then defer to her husband's wishes in public. It was a delicate dance that Sarah had watched her entire life, one that had shaped her own relationship with conflict. The ceremony itself had gone beautifully. Sarah walked down the aisle to Jake's beaming face, her father's arm tense beneath her hand, but his public smile perfectly in place. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to support each other's dreams and face challenges together. Jake's voice cracked with emotion as he promised to love her unconditionally, a word that resonated deeply for Sarah. The pastor pronounced them husband and wife, and for a brief, shining moment, everything felt perfect. The trouble began during the cocktail hour. Robert had been drinking steadily, his jovial public persona becoming more aggressive with each scotch and soda. He cornered one of Jake's groomsmen, a fellow firefighter named Marcus, and began interrogating him about the department's pension plan and job security. When Marcus mentioned that he was also studying to become a paramedic, Robert's tone shifted.
At least someone in that firehouse has ambition, Robert said, loudly enough for several guests to hear. Though I suppose not everyone can be expected to rise above their circumstances. Sarah felt the familiar knot form in her stomach. This was how it always started. Subtle digs that seemed almost complimentary on the surface, but carried a poisonous undertone. She had hoped that her wedding day might be immune to his particular brand of passive aggression, but she should have known better. During dinner, Robert stood to give his father of the bride speech. What should have been a moment of celebration became an exercise in public humiliation disguised as humor. He told stories from Sarah's childhood that highlighted her mistakes and failures, each anecdote delivered with a laugh that made the cruelty seem acceptable to those who didn't know him well. He described the time 8-year-old Sarah tried to bake a cake for his birthday, focusing on how she had burned it and forgotten to add sugar, rather than mentioning her sweet intention. He recounted her high school attempt to join the debate team, emphasizing how she had been cut after the first week rather than acknowledging her courage in trying something new. Each story followed the same pattern, a setup that seemed loving, followed by a punchline that diminished her achievements. Jake's jaw tightened with each story, but he maintained his composure, squeezing Sarah's hand under the table. She appreciated his restraint, knowing that confronting her father publicly would only make things worse. The other guests laughed politely, uncomfortable but unsure how to respond to the thinly veiled hostility. The speech concluded with what Robert probably thought was a touching moment. And now Sarah has found Jake, who I am sure will help keep her grounded and realistic about what she can achieve in life. Marriage is about accepting each other's limitations after all. The applause was scattered and uncomfortable. Sarah forced a smile and raised her champagne glass, but she could feel tears threatening behind her carefully applied makeup. This was exactly why she had considered eloping, why she had dreaded this day as much as she had anticipated it. After dinner, as the dancing began, Sarah tried to lose herself in the celebration. She danced with Jake, with her new father-in-law, who whispered kind words about how lucky Jake was to have her, and with several of Jake's friends who treated her with the respect and affection she rarely received from her own family. It was during a break between songs that disaster struck. Sarah had gone to touch up her lipstick when she overheard her father talking to a small group of his business associates near the bar. She paused behind a decorative column, not meaning to eavesdrop, but unable to walk away once she heard her name. Sarah's always been the disappointment, Robert was saying, his words slightly slurred. Her brother Michael, now there's a success story. Medical school, residency at Johns Hopkins, engaged to a surgeon. But Sarah? She peaked in high school. Nursing was probably the best we could hope for considering her limitations. One of the men, someone Sarah recognized as a client of her father's, made a polite murmur of disagreement. She seems like a lovely young woman, Robert, and nursing is an honorable
Profession. Robert laughed harshly. Honorable? Sure, but let's be realistic. She'll work a few years, have some kids, and that'll be it. No real ambition, no drive to excel. I used to think she'd surprise me, but some people just aren't built for greatness. At least Jake seems like a decent enough guy to take care of her when she inevitably gives up on having a career. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Disappointment, limitations, not built for greatness. These were the thoughts her father carried about her, the judgments he shared with strangers at her own wedding. She stood frozen behind the column, 28 years of similar moments crashing over her like a tide. She remembered being 12 and showing him her honor roll certificate, only to have him point out that her friend Emma had made high honor roll. She remembered being 16 and telling him about her acceptance to the state university's competitive nursing program, only to hear him sigh and say he had hoped she would aim higher. She remembered being 26 and showing him the commendation she received for her work during a particularly difficult pediatric case, only to have him change the subject to her brother's latest achievement.
Sarah realized with painful clarity that she had spent her entire life trying to prove her worth to someone who had decided long ago that she had none. Every accomplishment had been measured against impossible standards, every success diminished by comparison to someone else's greater achievement. She had internalized his voice so completely that she sometimes wondered if he was right, if she really was settling for less than she was capable of. But standing there in her wedding dress, listening to her father dismiss her life's work to near strangers, something inside Sarah finally rebelled. She was a pediatric nurse who had saved lives, who had comforted grieving families, who had chosen a profession dedicated to caring for society's most vulnerable members. She owned her own home, had built meaningful friendships, and had found a partner who loved her without reservation. By any reasonable measure, she was successful and fulfilled. Yet her father's voice in her head whispered that it wasn't enough, would never be enough, because she wasn't the son he had wanted or the daughter he had envisioned. The realization was both devastating and liberating. If nothing she did would ever satisfy him, then perhaps it was time to stop trying. Sarah straightened her shoulders and walked back into the reception area, her decision made. She would not let this man's limited vision define her worth any longer. She would not pretend that his approval mattered when it came with such a steep price. She would not smile and nod while he diminished her in front of the people who should have been celebrating her happiness. As she approached the dance floor where Jake was waiting with an expectant smile, her father intercepted her path. His face was flushed from alcohol and exertion, and she could smell the scotch on his breath as he leaned close. "Having fun at your little party?" he asked with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Try to remember that all of this costs money. Real money. The kind that comes from actual success, not from playing nurse." The casual cruelty in his voice, the dismissal of her profession as playing, the implication that she was somehow responsible for expenses he had insisted on paying, finally pushed Sarah past her breaking point. For 28 years, she had swallowed his insults, made excuses for his behavior, and protected his reputation by suffering in silence. But this was her wedding day, and she was surrounded by people who loved and respected her. She would not be diminished here. Not anymore. "Dad," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest, "I need you to stop." He raised an eyebrow, apparently surprised by her directness. "Stop what? I'm just trying to keep you grounded in reality. Someone has to." "You're trying to hurt me," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger, "at my own wedding, in front of my friends and—"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. New husband. "And I'm asking you to stop." Robert's expression shifted from surprise to anger. The public nature of the confrontation seemed to enrage him more than her actual words. Several nearby guests had stopped their conversations to watch the exchange, sensing the tension in the air. "Don't you dare speak to me like that," he hissed, stepping closer. "After everything I've done for you, everything I've paid for, this is how you show gratitude? By embarrassing me in front of my colleagues?" Sarah felt Jake appear beside her, his presence a steadying force, but she didn't step back. "I'm not trying to embarrass you, Dad. I'm trying to have one day where you don't tell me I'm not good enough." The silence that followed was deafening. The band had stopped playing, conversations had ceased, and 300 guests were witnessing the Mitchell family drama unfold in real time. Sarah could see her mother's horrified face from across the room, could feel the weight of all those watching eyes, but she couldn't back down. Not this time. Robert's face darkened to a dangerous shade of red. When he spoke, his voice carried across the entire ballroom, ensuring that every guest heard his verdict. "You want to know the truth, Sarah? You've always been worthless. Worthless as a daughter, worthless as a student, worthless as a professional. I've spent 28 years trying to make something of you, but you can't make diamonds from coal. Today just proves what I've always known. You're a disappointment who will never amount to anything meaningful."
The champagne glass slipped from Sarah's trembling fingers, crashing against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever. The word worthless hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything it touched. Sarah stood motionless in the center of the dance floor, her wedding dress suddenly feeling like a costume she had no right to wear. But it was what happened next that would change everything. Not just for Sarah, but for every person in that ballroom who heard one man's cruel assessment of his daughter's worth. In the corner booth, where he had been sitting quietly throughout the reception, an elderly man in a navy uniform began to stand. His movements were deliberate and dignified, despite his advanced age, and the ribbons and medals on his chest caught the light as he rose to his full height. Admiral James Harrison, retired after 43 years of distinguished service, had been watching the evening unfold with growing discomfort. He knew Robert Mitchell only as a business acquaintance, someone who had helped facilitate the purchase of property for a veterans' housing project. He had accepted the wedding invitation out of politeness, expecting a pleasant evening of celebration. Instead, he had witnessed something that stirred memories of every young sailor, Marine, and Coast Guardman he had ever served alongside. The devastating power of a parent's rejection and the urgent need for someone, anyone, to stand up and say enough. As Admiral Harrison stood in his corner booth, every eye in the ballroom turned towards him. The silence was complete now, broken only by Sarah's quiet sobbing and the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. What happened next would become the defining moment, not just for Sarah's wedding day, but of her entire understanding of her own worth and place in the world. Admiral James Harrison had served his country through 3 wars, commanded vessels carrying thousands of souls across treacherous waters, and stood witness to both the nobility and cruelty that human beings were capable of displaying under pressure. In all those years of service, through all the ceremonies and commemorations, through countless moments where protocol demanded he remain standing or seated according to military custom, he had never felt a more urgent need to rise to his feet than he did in that moment. The elderly officer moved with deliberate precision, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the table as he lifted himself from the booth. At 81, his joints protested the sudden movement, but his spine remained straight, his shoulders
squared in the posture that had been drilled into him during his first week at the Naval Academy 6 decades earlier. The silence in the ballroom was so complete that the soft rustle of his dress uniform seemed amplified, drawing every gaze in his direction. Sarah stood frozen in the aftermath of her father's devastating words, tears streaming down her cheeks, her wedding dress stained with champagne from the shattered glass at her feet. She was unaware that salvation was approaching from across the room, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. All she knew was the crushing weight of public humiliation and the echo of that word, worthless, reverberating through her consciousness. Jake had moved closer to his new wife, his arms sliding protectively around her waist, his firefighter's instincts kicking in as he assessed the situation. He could see that Sarah was in shock, could feel the tremor in her body as she struggled to process what had just happened. His own anger at Robert Mitchell burned hot in his chest, but his priority was Sarah, getting her away from this toxic situation, finding a way to salvage what should have been the happiest day of their lives. Robert himself stood with his arms crossed, apparently satisfied with the devastation he had wrought. The alcohol had loosened his tongue, but it had also stripped away any pretense of paternal concern. This was Robert Mitchell in his truest form, a man who measured his own worth by diminishing others, who could not tolerate the possibility that his daughter might find happiness and validation beyond his narrow definition of success. Linda Mitchell remained frozen in her front row seat, her hands pressed to her mouth in horror. 32 years of marriage had shown her every facet of her husband's capacity for cruelty, but even she was shocked by his willingness to destroy their daughter so publicly, so completely. She wanted to stand, to rush to Sarah's defense, to finally speak the words she had kept bottled up for decades, but the patterns of a lifetime held her paralyzed. The wedding guests sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to look away out of respect for Sarah's privacy or continue watching this family drama unfold.
Some were already reaching for their phones, calculating whether this moment was too personal to record or too dramatic to resist. Others were whispering among themselves, trying to process what they had just witnessed, wondering if they should intervene or simply pretend they hadn't seen anything at all. It was into this tableau of shock and uncertainty that Admiral Harrison began his slow, purposeful walk across the ballroom floor. His dress shoes clicked against the marble with military precision, each step measured and deliberate. The ribbons and medals on his chest caught the light from the crystal chandeliers, creating small rainbows that danced across the walls as he moved. Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart, Navy Cross, Distinguished Service Medal, Legion of Merit, and a dozen others, each representing moments of courage, sacrifice, and service that spanned nearly half a century. As Admiral Harrison approached the dance floor where Sarah stood, Admiral Harrison's mind was flooded with memories of the young men and women he had served alongside, trained, and commanded. He thought of Seaman Rodriguez, barely 18, who had pulled 3 sailors from a burning engine room during the Falkland conflict. He remembered Lieutenant Commander Chen, who had voluntarily extended her deployment to provide medical care in a refugee camp. He recalled Chief Petty Officer Washington, who had spent his shore leave teaching literacy classes to disadvantaged children in port cities around the world. None of these heroes had come from wealth or privilege. None had been handed their opportunities on silver platters, or defined by their parents' expectations. They had earned their worth through service, through courage, through the daily choice to put others before themselves. And now, standing before this young woman whose profession was dedicated to healing children, Admiral Harrison saw that same spirit.
Service being crushed by a man who had never understood what real valor looked like. Sarah became aware of the Admiral's approach when she heard the collective intake of breath from the assembled guests. She looked up through her tears to see this distinguished elderly man walking directly toward her, his expression grave but kind, his bearing unmistakably military despite his advanced age. She had noticed him earlier during the cocktail hour, had wondered who he was and how he connected to either family, but the reception had been too chaotic for proper introductions. When Admiral Harrison reached the center of the dance floor, he stopped precisely 3 feet from Sarah, close enough to speak with her directly, but far enough away to maintain appropriate respect for her personal space. What happened next would be burned into the memory of every person in that ballroom for the rest of their lives. The Admiral brought his heels together with a sharp click that echoed through the silent room. His right hand rose to his forehead in a salute that was picture-perfect in its execution, despite the arthritis in his fingers and the decades since he had last worn his uniform in active service. His back was ramrod straight, his gaze fixed on Sarah's face with an intensity that seemed to see directly into her soul. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command, but tempered with genuine warmth. "It is my distinct honor to salute a true servant and hero." The words hung in the air like a benediction, their power magnified by the complete silence of the ballroom. Sarah stared at the stranger who was offering her the respect and recognition that her own father had just so publicly denied. She didn't understand why he was saluting her, didn't feel worthy of such an honor, but something deep inside her chest began to loosen, like a knot that had been tied too tightly for too long, finally beginning to give way. Admiral Harrison held the salute for a full 10 seconds, a gesture of respect typically reserved for fallen comrades and visiting dignitaries. When he finally lowered his hand, he took one step closer to Sarah, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone, but still carrying clearly across the silent room. "Young lady," he began, "I have had the privilege of serving alongside some of the finest individuals this nation has ever produced. I have seen courage under fire, sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds, and dedication that goes far beyond the call of duty. And I want you to know that the work you do every single day, caring for sick children, comforting frightened families, using your skills and knowledge to heal and protect our most vulnerable citizens, that work places you among the most honorable people I have ever had the pleasure to encounter."
Sarah's tears had stopped flowing, replaced by a look of wonder and confusion. She still didn't understand why this stranger was offering her such praise, but his words were like water to someone dying of thirst. After a lifetime of having her achievements diminished and her worth questioned, here was someone speaking to her with respect, with recognition, with an understanding of the value of service that her own father had never possessed. The Admiral continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his theme. I have read about your work at Children's Medical Center. The night you spent with the Henderson family when their 4-year-old daughter was fighting for her life after that car accident. The way you advocated for better pain management protocols in the pediatric ward. The volunteer work you do at the free clinic on weekends, treating children whose families cannot afford health care. These are not the actions of someone worthless, Ms. Mitchell. These are the actions of someone who has dedicated her life to service, to making the world a better place for others. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. She had never mentioned any of those specific incidents to anyone outside her immediate circle of friends and colleagues. The Henderson family situation had happened 3 years ago, something she had been working on quietly with the hospital administration. The free clinic work was something she did because it needed to be done, not because she wanted recognition for it. How could this stranger possibly know these details about her life and work? Admiral Harrison noticed her confusion and offered a small smile. "You're wondering how I know these things," he said gently. "The truth is, Miss Mitchell, that genuine heroes often don't realize they're being watched and appreciated. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, at the Children's Hospital, is my granddaughter. She has spoken of you countless times over family dinners, always with the highest respect and admiration. According to her, you are one of the finest nurses she has ever worked with, someone who combines technical skill with genuine compassion in ways that make a real difference in the lives of patients and families." The revelation sent a ripple of murmurs through the assembled guests. Dr. Morgan was well known in Hartford's medical community, a respected pediatric physician whose opinion carried significant weight. The idea that she had been praising Sarah's work to her family, that Sarah's reputation extended beyond her immediate workplace, was news to most of the wedding guests and certainly to Sarah herself. Robert Mitchell's face had grown increasingly red during the Admiral's speech. The public nature of this endorsement, the specific details about Sarah's work, the obvious respect being shown by this distinguished military officer, all of it contradicted the narrative he had just painted of his daughter as a failure and disappointment. He could feel the mood in the room shifting, could sense that his authority and credibility were being challenged in ways that made him deeply uncomfortable. "Now wait just a minute," Robert interrupted, his voice slurred with alcohol and sharp with indignation. "I don't know who you think you are, but you have no business interfering in private family matters. Sarah is my daughter, and I know better than anyone what she's capable of and what she isn't." Admiral Harrison turned slowly to face Robert, his expression shifting from warmth to something far more authoritative. When he spoke, his voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, someone whose words could determine the fates of thousands of people under his command. "Sir," the Admiral said, investing that single word with enough ice to freeze the champagne fountain. "I am Admiral James Harrison, United States Navy, retired. I have spent 43 years in service to this nation, commanding vessels, training officers, and leading men and women in some of the most challenging circumstances imaginable. In all that time, I have learned to recognize true worth when I see it, and I have developed a particular intolerance for those who would diminish the contributions of others in order to elevate themselves." The formality and authority in the Admiral's voice seemed to fill the entire ballroom, making everyone present acutely aware that they were in the presence of someone who had wielded significant power and responsibility. Robert, despite his wealth and local influence, found himself facing someone whose credentials and moral authority far exceeded his own. The Admiral continued, his gaze never leaving Robert's face. Your daughter has chosen a profession that requires not only extensive education and technical training, but also emotional intelligence, physical stamina, and moral courage. She works with children who are sick, scared, and in pain. She provides comfort to families facing their worst nightmares. She makes life and death decisions under pressure, and according to every account I have heard, she does so with skill, compassion, and integrity. Admiral Harrison took a step closer to Robert, close enough that his words carried even more weight. In my experience, sir, the people who truly understand worth and value are those who have dedicated their lives to serving others. Your daughter has done exactly that. The question is not whether she has worth, but whether
You have the wisdom to recognize it. The silence that followed was even deeper than before, if such a thing were possible. Robert Mitchell, a man accustomed to dominating every room he entered, found himself speechless in the face of such direct and authoritative contradiction. He looked around the ballroom, seeking support from his business associates and friends, but found only uncomfortable faces and averted gazes. The balance of power in the room had shifted completely, and everyone present could feel it. Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement. In 30 seconds, this stranger had accomplished something she had been trying to do her entire life. He had stood up to her father and refused to accept his diminishing assessment of her worth. More than that, he had done so with facts and specifics, with references to her actual work and achievements, with the kind of detailed knowledge that could only come from genuine respect and attention. Jake, still standing beside his wife, felt his own admiration for the Admiral growing with each word. As a firefighter, he understood the importance of service professions, knew how much courage it took to run toward danger when others ran away. He had seen Sarah's dedication firsthand, had watched her come home exhausted from particularly difficult shifts, but still find energy to volunteer at the free clinic or attend continuing education courses to improve her skills. To hear someone else recognize and articulate that dedication so eloquently was deeply moving. Admiral Harrison turned back to Sarah, his expression softening again as he addressed her directly. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "I want you to understand something that your father seems incapable of grasping. Military service comes in many forms. Not all heroes wear uniforms or carry weapons. Some carry stethoscopes in healing hands. Some fight battles in hospital corridors instead of foreign battlefields. Some save lives with medical knowledge instead of tactical training." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But the courage is the same, the dedication is the same, the willingness to put others before yourself, to face difficult situations with strength and compassion, to persist in the face of challenges and setbacks. These qualities define true service members, regardless of whether they serve in the military, in hospitals, in fire departments, or in any profession dedicated to protecting and helping others." The Admiral's words were creating a visible transformation in Sarah's posture and expression. Her shoulders were straightening, her tears had stopped, and something like hope was beginning to replace the devastation in her eyes. For the first time in her life, she was hearing her work described not as a consolation prize or a stepping stone to something better, but as valuable and honorable in its own right. Furthermore, Admiral Harrison continued, his voice growing stronger, "I want everyone in this room to understand something about the nursing profession, because I suspect many of you, like Mr. Mitchell here, have some misconceptions about what it actually entails." He turned to address the entire assembled crowd, his command presence filling the ballroom as effectively as if he were addressing troops on a parade ground. Nurses are not assistants or subordinates to doctors. They are highly trained medical professionals with specialized knowledge and skills that are essential to patient care. They spend more time with patients than any other healthcare provider, which means they often catch critical changes in condition that others might miss. They advocate for patients who cannot advocate for themselves. They provide comfort and reassurance to people in their darkest hours. Caring for sick children and worried parents, these experiences made them better warriors and better leaders. Sarah felt something inside her chest expanding, a warmth and strength she hadn't experienced in years. This stranger was not only defending her profession, but was connecting it to military service, to courage, to honor. He was reframing everything she did in terms that even her father would have to respect, if he had any integrity left. But Admiral Harrison wasn't finished. He had one more revelation that would change the trajectory of this entire evening. One more piece of information that would transform Sarah's understanding of her own impact on the world. "There is one more thing I need to share with all of you," the Admiral said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone while still carrying clearly across the room. "Something that Miss Mitchell herself doesn't know, but something that demonstrates the true reach and impact of her service." He looked directly at Sarah, his aged eyes bright with something that looked almost like paternal pride. "2 years ago, my great-grandson Timothy was admitted to Children's Medical Center with acute appendicitis that had progressed to peritonitis. He was 7 years old, scared, and in tremendous pain. The surgery was successful, but his recovery was complicated by infection and other issues that kept him in the hospital for nearly 3 weeks. Sarah's eyes widened as she began to piece together the timeline and details the Admiral was sharing. A 7-year-old boy with complicated post-surgical recovery, 2 years ago, 3 weeks in the hospital. She was beginning to remember a case, a frightened little boy with dark hair and serious eyes who had struggled with pain management and had been afraid of all the medical equipment surrounding him. Admiral Harrison continued, his voice thick with emotion now. Timothy was terrified of all the medical procedures, all the strange machines and tubes and needles. He had stopped eating, wasn't sleeping, and was becoming increasingly withdrawn despite the best efforts of the medical team. His parents were desperate, afraid they might lose him, not to the medical condition, but to fear and despair. The Admiral paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. And then, a nurse came on shift who changed everything. She sat with Timothy for hours, not just during her assigned rounds, but during her breaks and even after her shift officially ended. She brought him books and read to him. She taught him games that distracted him from the pain. She advocated with the doctors for better pain management approaches that would allow him to be more comfortable and alert. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as the memory came flooding back. Timothy Harrison, the little boy who had reminded her so much of her younger brother at that age, who had been so brave despite his fear, who had called her nurse angel because he said she had wings like the angels in his storybooks. That nurse, Admiral Harrison said, his voice now carrying across the ballroom with the power of absolute conviction, that nurse didn't just provide medical care. She gave my great-grandson hope. She helped him find courage when he had none left. She turned a traumatic experience into something he could survive and overcome. She quite literally saved his life, not through medical procedures, but through compassion and dedication that went far beyond any job description. The Admiral took another step towards Sarah, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow still reached every corner of the silent room. That nurse was you, Miss Mitchell. And when Timothy talks about his time in the hospital now, he doesn't talk about the pain or the fear. He talks about Nurse Angel, who sat with him and read him stories and made him feel safe when the whole world seemed scary and uncertain. Sarah was crying again, but these were different tears. Tears of recognition and validation and overwhelming emotion. She remembered Timothy now, remembered how small and frightened he had seemed in that big hospital bed. Remembered the way his face had lit up when she brought him new books or taught him card games to pass the time during the long days of recovery. Admiral Harrison's final words carried the weight of absolute truth and unshakable conviction. Miss Mitchell, you are not worthless. You are not a disappointment. You are a healer, a protector, a guardian of those who cannot protect themselves. You are exactly what this world needs more of, and anyone who cannot see that is blind to the true meaning of service and sacrifice. The ballroom erupted. The standing ovation began with Jake,
who had been watching his wife's transformation with growing awe and pride. His applause was thunderous, desperate, as if he were trying to clap away every cruel word his new father-in-law had ever spoken. Within seconds, Dr. Morgan's colleagues from the medical community rose to their feet, followed by Jake's fellow firefighters, then the teachers, social workers, and other service professionals scattered throughout the reception. The wave of applause spread across the ballroom like wildfire until 300 wedding guests were on their feet, their applause echoing off the crystal chandeliers and marble columns. Some were wiping away tears, moved by Admiral Harrison's powerful words and the story of young Timothy. Others were simply responding to the raw emotion of the moment, the triumph of recognition over dismissal, of truth over cruelty. Sarah stood in the center of it all, still processing everything that had just happened. The applause washed over her like healing rain after a drought, each clap and cheer helping to rebuild something inside her that her father's words had tried to destroy. She looked around at all these people, colleagues, friends, Jake's family, even strangers who had witnessed her humiliation and were now celebrating her vindication, and felt a profound shift in how she saw herself and her place in the world. Admiral Harrison remained at attention throughout the ovation, his weathered face showing deep satisfaction at the response his words had generated. This was what leadership looked like, he reflected. Not tearing others down to build yourself up, but lifting people up to show them their true potential and worth. He'd spent decades training young officers, teaching them that true strength came from empowering others, not from dominating them. The only person not participating in the ovation was Robert Mitchell, who stood frozen near the head table, his face cycling through shades of red and purple as he watched his narrative completely dismantled. Everything he had said about Sarah being worthless, about nursing being beneath her capabilities, about her lack of ambition and achievement, had been systematically destroyed by this elderly military officer who spoke with the authority of someone who had actually witnessed real courage and service. Robert's business associates, the very people he had been trying to impress with his harsh assessment of his daughter, were now applauding that same daughter with genuine enthusiasm. His own brother Tom, who had always been quietly critical of Robert's treatment of his children, was applauding with particularly vigor, his expression making it clear that he was applauding not just Sarah's achievements, but also Admiral Harrison's courage in standing up to his brother's bullying. As the applause gradually died down and the guests resumed their seats, Admiral Harrison turned one final time to address Robert directly. His voice was quieter now, but it carried the unmistakable tone of someone delivering a verdict that was final and irrevocable. "Mr. Mitchell," the Admiral said, his words cutting through the settling quiet like a blade. "I have had the unfortunate experience of serving with officers who believed that leadership meant breaking down the people under their command, who thought that success was measured by how effectively they could diminish others. Without exception, these were the least effective leaders I ever encountered, and the most dangerous to the men and women who had the misfortune of serving under them."
The Admiral paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. True leadership, real strength, comes from recognizing the worth in others and helping them recognize it in themselves. Your daughter has spent her adult life doing exactly that, recognizing the worth and dignity of sick children, frightened families, colleagues who need support and guidance. She has built a career on the foundation of service and compassion, and the fact that you cannot see the honor in that says far more about your limitations than it does about hers. Robert opened his mouth to respond, his face flushed with anger and alcohol, but Admiral Harrison held up a hand that somehow commanded immediate silence. The gesture was subtle, but carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of presence that had once been capable of controlling entire naval vessels with a single look. "I am not finished, sir," the Admiral said firmly. "You stand here in front of 300 people at your daughter's wedding celebration, and you call her worthless. You dismiss her profession, her achievements,
her character and her value as a human being. You do this not in private, not in a moment of anger, but publicly, deliberately, with the apparent intention of causing maximum humiliation and pain. The Admiral's voice grew colder with each word, his disgust becoming more apparent. I have seen enemy combatants show more respect for their prisoners than you have shown for your own daughter on what should be the happiest day of her life. There is no honor in what you have done here, Mr. Mitchell. There is no justification, no excuse, no reasonable explanation for such cruelty towards someone who has dedicated her life to healing others. The silence in the ballroom was now complete and brittle, as if the air itself might shatter under the weight of the Admiral's condemnation. Robert Mitchell, a man accustomed to being the most powerful presence in any room, found himself not only challenged, but thoroughly defeated by someone whose moral authority was unassailable. Sarah watched this exchange with a mixture of amazement and growing strength. She had spent so many years absorbing her father's criticism, internalizing his assessment of her worth, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone defend her with such passion and conviction. Admiral Harrison wasn't just correcting her father's misconceptions about her profession, he was fundamentally reframing the entire conversation about value, success, and what it meant to live a meaningful life. Jake moved closer to his wife, slipping his arm around her waist in a gesture that was both protective and celebratory. He had watched Sarah struggle with her father's disapproval for the entire time they had been together, had seen how it undermined her confidence and caused her to question her own achievements. To witness this public vindication, this powerful affirmation of everything he already knew to be true about Sarah's character and worth, was profoundly moving. Furthermore, Admiral Harrison continued, his attention still focused on Robert, I want you to understand the full implications of what you have revealed about yourself tonight. Your daughter saves lives, comforts the suffering, and dedicates her professional existence to making the world a better place for children and families. And your response to this noble calling is to label it worthless? To suggest that she has somehow failed by choosing service over profit, compassion over ambition. The Admiral shook his head slowly, his expression showing both sadness and contempt. In my years of service, I learned to recognize the difference between those who understand duty and those who understand only self-interest. Your daughter understands duty, Mr. Mitchell. She understands service. She understands that true success is measured not by what you accumulate for yourself, but by what you contribute to others. The tragedy is not that she has somehow disappointed you. The tragedy is that you have failed so completely to recognize the extraordinary woman you raised. Robert's attempts to maintain his
Composure were visibly failing. His hands were shaking, whether from anger, alcohol, or the shock of being so thoroughly and publicly dismantled, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was strained and defensive. "You don't know anything about our family," he managed to say, though his words lacked any real conviction. "You don't know what I've sacrificed, what I've provided, what I've tried to do for her. She could have been anything, could have achieved so much more, but she settled for less. That's not my fault." Admiral Harrison's response was swift and devastating. "Mr. Mitchell, your daughter didn't settle for less. She chose more. She chose meaning over money, service over status, compassion over competition. She chose to dedicate her life to something larger than herself, something that makes a real difference in the world. The fact that you cannot understand this choice, cannot value it, cannot even respect it, reveals everything anyone needs to know about your own character and priorities." The Admiral took a step closer to Robert, his voice dropping to a tone that was somehow both quieter and more menacing. "And as for what you have provided and sacrificed, let me be very clear about something. Providing material support does not give you the right to destroy someone's spirit. Paying for education does not entitle you to diminish the value of how that education is used. Contributing to a wedding does not grant you permission to humiliate the bride at her own celebration."
Admiral Harrison straightened to his full height, his medals catching the light as he delivered his final judgment. "What you have done here tonight, sir, is unforgivable. Not just the words themselves, but the timing, the public nature of the attack, the deliberate cruelty of it. You have revealed yourself to be exactly the kind of man that good people spend their lives protecting others from. Your daughter's worth is not diminished by your inability to recognize it, but your own character certainly is." The silence that followed was profound and lasting. Robert Mitchell stood exposed and condemned, his authority shattered, his credibility destroyed in front of everyone whose opinion he had ever cared about. His business associates were looking at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. His own brother, Tom, was shaking his head sadly, as if grieving for the man Robert might have been if he had chosen differently. But it was Linda Mitchell's response that perhaps cut deepest. Sarah's mother, who had spent 32 years making excuses for her husband's behavior, quietly enabling his emotional abuse through her silence, slowly rose from her seat at the head table. Her face was pale but determined, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the ballroom with surprising strength. "Robert," she said quietly, "I think you should leave." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Linda had never, in all their years of marriage, publicly contradicted her husband, never challenged his authority in front of others, never taken such a definitive stand against his behavior. The fact that she was doing so now, at their daughter's wedding, in front of 300 witnesses, was perhaps the most shocking development in an evening already full of revelations. Robert stared at his wife as if she had suddenly become a complete stranger. "Linda, you can't be serious. This is our daughter's wedding. These are our friends, our colleagues." Linda's voice remained steady, though Sarah could see tears beginning to form in her mother's eyes. "Exactly, Robert. This is our daughter's wedding, and you have done everything possible to ruin it. These are our friends and colleagues, and you have humiliated yourself and our family in front of all of them. I have watched you tear Sarah down for 28 years, and I have said nothing, done nothing to stop it. I will not stand by silently anymore." The transformation in Linda was as dramatic as anything that had happened that evening. The quiet, deferential woman who had spent decades avoiding conflict was suddenly speaking with the voice.
Someone who had finally reached their breaking point. Her loyalty to her husband was being overwhelmed by her love for her daughter and her shame at her own complicity in years of emotional abuse. "Sarah," Linda continued, turning to address her daughter directly, "I owe you an apology that is 32 years overdue. I should have protected you from this. I should have stood up to your father years ago. I should have told you every day how proud I am of the woman you've become, how much I admire your dedication to helping others, how sorry I am that you had to grow up thinking that your worth was somehow in question." Sarah was crying again, but these tears were different from all the others she had shed that evening. These were tears of relief, of validation, of a burden she hadn't even realized she was carrying suddenly being lifted from her shoulders. Her mother's words were healing wounds that went back to childhood, addressing pain that Sarah had learned to carry silently because she thought no one else understood or cared. Admiral Harrison watched this family drama unfold with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice served. He had not intended to destroy Robert Mitchell's marriage or family relationships, but he recognized that sometimes the truth had consequences that went far beyond the immediate situation. Years of emotional abuse and manipulation had been exposed in a single evening, and the reckoning that was now taking place was both necessary and long overdue. Jake felt his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him as he watched his new wife finally receive the recognition and support she had always deserved. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, how much Sarah's father's disapproval had affected her self-confidence and sense of worth. To see her standing straighter, crying tears of relief rather than devastation, surrounded by people who were finally acknowledging her true value, was profoundly moving. The other wedding guests watched these family dynamics play out with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Many of them had witnessed similar patterns in their own families or social circles,
had seen how some parents used their children as extensions of their own egos, measuring their offspring's worth only in terms that reflected well on themselves. Admiral Harrison's intervention had not just defended Sarah, it had challenged everyone present to consider their own relationships, their own ways of measuring success and value. Robert, faced with his wife's ultimatum and the complete collapse of his social standing, made one final attempt to salvage the situation. His voice was different now, lacking the confident aggression that had characterized his earlier attacks, replaced by something that sounded almost like pleading. "This is ridiculous," he said, though even he seemed to recognize the weakness of his position. "I was just trying to keep Sarah grounded, to help her see reality. Someone has to tell her the truth about her limitations." Admiral Harrison's response was immediate and final. "Mr. Mitchell, the only limitation your daughter faces is having a father who cannot recognize her strengths. The only reality she needs to accept is that she deserves better treatment than you have given her. The only truth that matters here tonight is that she has built a life of service and meaning, while you have built a reputation for tearing down the people who should have been able to count on your support." The Admiral turned away from Robert then, dismissing him as effectively as if he had ordered him off a naval vessel. When he addressed the room again, his voice carried the warmth and authority of someone delivering a benediction rather than a condemnation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Harrison announced, "we are here to celebrate the marriage of two remarkable individuals who have dedicated their professional lives to serving others. Sarah Mitchell Thompson is a healer, a protector of children, a woman of compassion and skill who makes our community stronger and safer through her daily work. Jake Thompson is a firefighter, a first responder. Responders who run toward danger to protect people he has never met, whose courage and dedication keep our families safe." The Admiral's voice grew stronger as he continued, his words transforming the atmosphere in the ballroom from one of conflict and embarrassment to one of celebration and recognition. Together, they represent the very best of what service looks like in our society. They are the people we call when we need help, when our children are sick, when our homes are burning, when we face our darkest moments and need someone with training, courage, and compassion to guide us through. Admiral Harrison looked directly at Sarah and Jake, his expression filled with genuine admiration and respect. "Your marriage is not just the joining of two lives, it is the union of two servants, two protectors, two people who understand that true success is measured not by what you gain for yourself, but by what you give to others. That is the foundation of a partnership that will endure, that will grow stronger through whatever challenges you face, that will continue to make the world a better place for decades to come." The Admiral raised his hand slightly, as if offering a toast without lass. "So let us celebrate not just this wedding, but the example these two young people set for all of us. Let us honor their commitment to service, their dedication to helping others, their choice to build a life based on compassion rather than competition, on contribution rather than accumulation." The applause that followed was different from the earlier ovation. It was warmer, more sustained, filled with genuine appreciation for both Admiral Harrison's words and the couple he was honoring. People were not just clapping, they were celebrating, acknowledging, affirming the value of service and the importance of recognizing it. Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her as she listened to the Admiral's words and the response they generated. For the first time in her adult life, she was seeing herself through the eyes of people who understood and valued what she did, who saw her profession as heroic rather than settling, who recognized her choices as evidence of strength rather than limitation. Jake squeezed her hand, his own eyes bright with emotion, as he watched his wife finally receive the recognition she deserved. He had always known her worth, had always admired her dedication and compassion, but seeing it acknowledged so publicly and powerfully was validating in ways he hadn't expected. As the applause died down, Admiral Harrison approached Sarah and Jake directly,
his formal demeanor softening into something more grandfatherly and warm. When he spoke to them, his voice was pitched for their ears only, though several nearby guests could overhear his words. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, using Sarah's new married name with deliberate emphasis, "I want you to understand something that I hope you will remember for the rest of your life. Your worth is not determined by anyone else's ability to recognize it. Your value does not depend on anyone else's approval or understanding. You are valuable because of who you are, what you contribute, and how you choose to live your life in service to others." Sarah nodded, tears still flowing, but her voice steady when she responded. "Thank you, Admiral Harrison. I don't know how to express what your words have meant to me tonight. How much it means to know that Timothy is doing well, that something I did made a difference in his recovery." Admiral Harrison smiled, the stern military bearing giving way to genuine warmth and affection. "My dear, you make a difference every day. Timothy's story is just one example among hundreds, maybe thousands of lives you have touched and improved through your work. The tragedy would have been if you had allowed your father's blindness to convince you that your contributions don't matter." He turned to Jake, extending his hand in a firm handshake. "And you, young man, protect your wife from anyone who tries to diminish her worth, including family members."
Should know better. She is a treasure, a genuine hero, and she deserves to be treated as such. Jake's handshake was equally firm, his voice thick with emotion when he replied, "I will, sir. I promise you that. Sarah has always been my hero, and after tonight, I think she's starting to see herself the way I've always seen her." Admiral Harrison nodded approvingly, then stepped back to address both of them together. Marriage is a partnership between equals, between people who recognize and celebrate each other's strengths, who support each other through difficulties, who build each other up rather than tearing each other down. You two already understand that truth, which gives your marriage a foundation that many couples never achieve. The Admiral paused, glancing towards where Robert Mitchell still stood near the head table, isolated now and visibly shaken by the evening's events. "Learn from what you have witnessed tonight," he said quietly. "Learn the difference between criticism that builds up and criticism that tears down. Learn to recognize the difference between people who want to help you grow and people who want to diminish you, to make themselves feel larger. Most importantly, learn to trust your own understanding of your worth, especially when others try to convince you that you have none." As Admiral Harrison stepped back, preparing to return to his table and allow the celebration to continue, Sarah called out to him one more time. "Admiral," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the nearby area, "would you honor us by giving a proper toast? I think everyone here would like to hear from you again." The request was immediately seconded by Jake, then by several nearby guests, and soon the entire ballroom was calling for Admiral Harrison to offer a wedding toast. The elderly officer looked around at all the expectant faces, at the couple who had just endured such a public trial, at the wedding guests who had witnessed both cruelty and redemption in the span of a single evening. Admiral Harrison moved to the center of the dance floor one more time, his bearing once again formal and commanding. The ballroom fell silent as he prepared to speak, 300 people hanging on the words of this distinguished stranger who had transformed their understanding of the evening's events. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Harrison began, his voice carrying easily across the hushed room, "I have had the privilege tonight of witnessing something extraordinary. Not just a wedding, but a testament to the power of true love, genuine service, and unshakable integrity in the face of opposition." He looked directly at Sarah and Jake, his expression filled with admiration and respect. "Sarah and Jake Thompson have shown us tonight what real strength looks like. Not the strength that comes from tearing others down, but the strength that comes from building others up. Not the strength that demands recognition and praise, but the strength that quietly serves without expecting acknowledgement. Not the strength that seeks to dominate and control, but the strength that protects and heals and comforts. Admiral Harrison raised his voice slightly, ensuring that every person in the ballroom heard his next words clearly. In my decades of military service, I learned that true heroes are often the people who never think of themselves as heroic. They're the nurses who stay late to comfort a frightened child, the firefighters who risk their lives for strangers, the teachers who see potential where others see problems, the social workers who advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves. The Admiral's voice grew warmer as he continued. Sarah and Jake represent the best of this tradition. They have chosen professions that require not just technical skill, but moral courage, not just professional competence, but personal compassion. They understand that success is not measured by wealth accumulated or status achieved, but lives saved, families comforted, communities protected.
Thoughts? So I ask you to join me in toasting not just this marriage, but the example these two young people set for all of us. Let us celebrate their commitment to service, their dedication to others, their understanding that the highest calling in life is to make the world better for those who come after us. The Admiral raised his hand as if holding a champagne glass, his voice ringing with conviction and authority. To Sarah and Jake Thompson, may your marriage be blessed with the same joy you bring to others through your service. May your love grow stronger with each life you touch and each person you help. And may you always remember that true worth is measured not by what others think of you, but by what you contribute to the world around you. The toast that followed was unlike any wedding reception had ever heard. It was not just applause, but a roar of approval. Not just celebration, but affirmation. Not just congratulation, but recognition of something larger than a single couple's happiness. People were on their feet, raising their glasses, calling out their own words of support and encouragement. Sarah and Jake stood in the center of it all, holding hands, tears streaming down both their faces, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and recognition. The evening that had begun with such promise, then descended into humiliation and pain, had been transformed into something extraordinary, a public affirmation of their worth, their choices, and their future together. As the celebration continued around them, Sarah looked across the ballroom and saw her father standing alone near the exit, his face a mask of defeat and confusion. For a moment, she felt a flicker of the old sympathy, the old desire to comfort him and smooth over the conflict. But then she remembered Admiral Harrison's words about learning to recognize the difference between people who wanted to help her grow and people who wanted to diminish her. Instead of approaching her father, Sarah turned back to her husband, to the Admiral who had defended her so powerfully, to the guests who were celebrating her and Jake with such genuine enthusiasm. She realized that she had spent so much energy over the years trying to earn approval from someone who was determined not to give it, that she had missed all the approval and recognition that was already there from people who truly understood her value. The reception continued for several more hours, but it had been fundamentally transformed by the evening's events. Instead of the formal, somewhat stiff celebration that Robert Mitchell had planned, it became a genuine party, a real celebration of love and service and community. People shared stories about their own experiences with nurses and firefighters, about times when they had been helped by people like Sarah and Jake, about the difference that service professionals made in their lives. Admiral Harrison stayed until nearly midnight, regaling guests with stories about his military service and drawing parallels between military heroism and civilian service that helped everyone present understand the true nature of what Sarah and Jake did for their community. His presence transformed the evening from a wedding reception into something more like a celebration of service itself. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah and Jake found themselves standing with Admiral Harrison near the ballroom entrance, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people whose entire understanding of the couple had been transformed by the evening's events. Dr. Morgan, Admiral Harrison's granddaughter, approached them with tears in her eyes and gratitude in her voice. "Sarah," she said, embracing her colleague warmly, "I've tried for years to tell my grandfather about your work, about what an extraordinary nurse you are, but I never imagined he would have the opportunity to tell you himself or to do it so powerfully." Sarah hugged her back, her voice thick with emotion. "Elizabeth, I had no idea you had been talking about me to your family. It means more than you know, especially tonight to learn
that my work has been noticed and appreciated." Dr. Morgan turned to Admiral Harrison with obvious pride and affection. "Grandpa, thank you for what you did tonight. Sarah needed to hear those words, needed someone with your authority and conviction to say them. You gave her a gift that will last the rest of her life." Admiral Harrison smiled at his granddaughter, then looked back at Sarah and Jake one more time. "The gift was mutual," he said quietly. "I needed to be reminded that heroism comes in many forms, that service continues in countless ways, and that sometimes the most important thing an old soldier can do is recognize and honor the soldiers who are still fighting the good fight." As Admiral Harrison prepared to leave, Sarah impulsively asked him one more question. "Admiral, will you tell Timothy that Nurse Angel wishes him well? That she's proud of how brave he was and that she hopes he's grown up strong and healthy?" Admiral Harrison's eyes misted over as he nodded. "I will tell him, Mrs. Thompson. And I will tell him that Nurse Angel got married tonight, that she was honored by an entire room full of people who understand her worth, and that she continues to be a hero to children and families who are lucky enough to have her in their lives." The final handshakes and embraces were exchanged, and Admiral Harrison departed, leaving behind a transformed celebration and a completely changed understanding of what had taken place that evening. Robert Mitchell had left hours earlier, his departure so quiet and unremarked that most guests hadn't even noticed. Linda Mitchell remained, helping to coordinate the end of the reception and apologizing repeatedly to Sarah and Jake for her husband's behavior. As Sarah and Jake finally prepared to leave their own wedding reception, they stood together in the now empty ballroom, looking at the scattered remnants of the evening. The broken champagne glass that had been cleaned up hours earlier, the head table where such drama had played out, the dance floor where Admiral Harrison had delivered his powerful defense. "How do you feel?" Jake asked his new wife, pulling her close as they surveyed the scene of their triumph. Sarah considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her emotions after such an extraordinary evening. "Tired," she said finally. "Grateful. Vindicated. Hopeful. And for the first time in my adult life, completely certain of my own worth." Jake kissed her forehead, his voice filled with love and admiration. "Good," he said, "because I've always known your worth, and after tonight, I think the whole world does too." As they walked out of the Riverside Country Club together, hand in hand, Sarah reflected on the evening's events and their larger meaning. She had learned that worth was not something that could be granted or taken away by others, but something that existed independently, something that was demonstrated through choices and actions and service. She had learned that the people whose opinions truly mattered were those who understood and valued service, who recognized courage in its many forms, who appreciated the difference between success and significance. Most importantly, she had learned that she was not alone, that her work mattered, that her life had meaning and impact far beyond what she had ever realized. Admiral Harrison's defense had not just protected her from her father's cruelty. It had opened her eyes to a larger community of people who understood and appreciated what she did, who saw her profession as heroic rather than ordinary, who recognized her daily choices as evidence of character and strength. The marriage of Sarah and Jake Thompson began that night, not just with promises and rings and legal documents, but with a profound understanding of their own worth and the value of the service they provided to their community.
They drove away from their wedding reception not as victims of family drama or objects of pity, but as recognized heroes whose dedication had been publicly honored and whose future together was bright with purpose and meaning.
Slowly returned to normal, the staff cleaning up the remnants of a celebration that had become something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. But the impact of Admiral Harrison's words, the transformation of Sarah's understanding of her own worth, and the public recognition of service and sacrifice would last far beyond that single evening, rippling outward to touch lives and relationships in ways that would be felt for years to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.